Speaker.
Well, welcome back to the Bible for Dummies here at Chapel by the Sea on Fort Myers Beach as we continue with our study on the story of the Bible. We're looking at the narrative, how the story flows from one piece to another. So one by one, we're going through. The Bible doesn't go this way. The Bible clumps its books by topic and subject, but we're going in a straight narrative as we explore this. So today we're talking about kingdom and monarchy, exile and restoration. We're going to cover a lot of territory today, a lot of time, because we begin about 1030 BC and we'll go all the way to about 450 BC. About 600 years of history we're going to cover. And we start with Saul, David, and Solomon. And then as the kingdoms divide, which you may not know, but there was a big division and they split the country. We're going to look at what's covered in 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, and 1st and 2nd Chronicles. And actually, we begin prior to Saul with Samuel. Samuel is the last judge in Israel, and he's known as a prophet, a priest, and a judge. So as the prophet, his role is to bring the word of the Lord. So the prophet doesn't tell the future. The prophet tells you what God says. So their message always begins, thus saith the Lord. And then he tells you what the Lord's message is. And basically it says, do what I say and you will live, disobey me and you'll have trouble or you will die. As the priest, he leads the country in worshiping God. And his job is to move around. There's no real central place for the worship. So he goes and moves around and leads worship and sacrifice in various places. And as such, he intercedes before God for the people. And as judge, he's exercising at the same time he's moving around to bring worship, he's also going around to administer civil order. And so Samuel's role was maintaining both the civil order and the spiritual life of the people. Now, the Philistines down by the seacoast, in what is now the Gaza Strip, they're exercising control over the economy and the area because they know how to smelt iron. So technology determines who's the boss. But the people are beset by raiding parties from the Philistines. So they want to get together. They want to unify. The people decide we need a king to pull us together. And Samuel explains to them, if you have a king, there are duties that come with being a king and what the king expects. So the king is always the servant of God. The king cannot rule on his own and say, this is what I want to do. No, he always answers to God. He may not act above God's law. So he has to be subject to it. So you need Samuel or somebody in the role of prophet, priest, and judge to advise the king. He leads the people to victories, maybe to failures too, but he leads the people and leads the army. He's going to take your sons for his army, he tells them. So are you prepared for that? Not only that, he's going to take your money and taxes. Now, how do you think that would sell today? Not very well. But what do the people say? Just give us a king. So we meet Saul, the man who would not be king. This is a strange story when you get into it. Samuel is told to go anoint Saul to be king. And Saul is a son of Kish. He's a Benjaminite, but he's also a big guy, the big fella. Any of you Irish? Well, first ruler of the Republic of Ireland was known as the big fellow. Well, he's a foot taller than everybody else. So he stands out. And he's out searching for his mules that have been lost. And he meets Samuel, who anoints him as king in a private ceremony. And now you would expect to go home and say, hey, Pop, guess what? I'm the new king. No, he goes home and he doesn't tell anybody about the anointing. But the people get together at Mizpah, and Samuel shows up and says, I've anointed your king. And they say, well, who is it? He says, well, Saul, son of Kish. Where is he? They start looking around for him and they find him hiding among the baggage. He's embarrassed. He's brought out, he's acknowledged as king, and everybody goes home. Talk about an anticlimax of the story. Well, eventually he unites the tribes. He gets things moving. He pulls the people together. He's going to reign for 20 years, from 1030 to 1010 BC. He fortifies a place called Gibeah, which is just north of Jerusalem. And the chief enemy, as I said, is the Philistines, the people of the coastland. And they know how to smelt iron. So they control the economy, they control it militarily, they control what's going on. And they have bands that go out periodically on raids and terrorize the Jews. Now, Saul's son Jonathan is a very effective officer, and several times he leads battles in which they do defeat the Philistines. But Saul is a troubled personality. He's got some serious weaknesses. And on 2 occasions, there are major stories of how he fails God. One is when they are going out to fight the Philistines. He's called Samuel to come and offer a sacrifice for them before they go out. And Samuel is delayed and Saul's impatient. So Saul says, forget it, I'll take care of it myself. So he goes out and he goes over and offers a sacrifice. And then Samuel shows up and says, what have you done? You've affronted God. So as a consequence, your family will not rule Israel. None of your sons are going to take over from you. Second time was he has been to battle against the Amalekites and defeated them. And he's been told, he's been instructed by Samuel that God has said, you are to slay all the people and all the animals. You're not to leave any alive. So he keeps the Amalek king alive, and he keeps the best of the animals for himself. And when Samuel arrives, he says, why do I hear animals? What's going on? And he says, oh, well, I saved the best animals so I could make a fitting sacrifice to God. And Samuel's response is, surely it is better to obey than to sacrifice. That's a consequence. This kingdom will pass from you. So after that incident, he is told to go anoint a new king. And he goes down to Bethlehem to the house of Jesse to find the new king. And Jesse parades all his sons before him. And God says, after each one, God says, that's not the one. That's not the one. And finally, he says, do you have any more kids? Well, it's just the youngest one. He's out taking care of the sheep. He says, well, we're not going to offer the sacrifice until he comes. So they bring in David. And when he sees him, God says, this is the one. And so he goes and he anoints him. And David is still a shepherd. He's still a boy, but his time is coming. And that's kind of the prelude of the story. He ends up working for the house of Saul. Saul is suffering from extreme depression, from what we can gather from the account that's given. So he's depressed, and they find that music soothes him. So David is hired to come in and play the lyre for him, or the harp, and soothe Saul's spirits. So this goes on for a while, but then we have a development. The Philistines gather with their champion, Goliath of Gath, to battle the Israelites. And he sends out a challenge. Come fight, send your champion to fight me, and whoever wins, winner take all. If you win, we serve you. If I win, you serve us. This guy's 9 feet tall, and his javelin has, they describe his armament is massive. Probably he suffers from, I think it's called agoromegaly. It's a giantism disease. And the person grows huge, but there's side effects. Number one, you have difficulty moving. You lumber, you're not agile. And the second one is it restricts your vision. Your eyesight is not very good with this stuff. But he's huge and terrifies. Nobody will go up and challenge this guy. And every day he goes out and he makes the challenge again. You know, they all kind of beat their shields and rattle their sabers and go back to their tents. David is sent to take food to his brothers who are in the army. And when he visits, he hears this challenge and he says, why aren't you going up against this guy? He says, I'll do it. I'll take care of it. So he's taken into Saul, and he tells Saul, I can do this. And when you read the story, he says, I take care of my father's sheep. And when a lion or a bear attacks them and drags them up, I go after him and I kill the bear with my hands. Because I have killed lions and I have killed bears. I can kill this Philistine. Now think about that. This is a kid going after a lion or a bear, and he's killed them. This guy's got some serious power behind him. Saul offers him his armor, but when he puts it on, he can't move. So he says, no, I can't, I'm not going to do that. So he goes forth armed only with a sling and stone. Now, first thing you got to get clear in your mind is, this is not a slingshot. This is a serious weapon he's carrying. In the ancient world, you had archers, you had spearmen, and you had slingers. And when these guys pick up one of these 5-pound stones, and when they get that thing going and let it go, it's flying at 200 miles an hour. When it hits its target, it has the impact of a .45 slug hitting them. This is a serious weapon. And your typical sling is about that long. It's not a little slingshot. It's a big, powerful weapon. What's David do all day long while he's sitting watching sheep? Bored out of his mind. So he's taking this sling and he's just practicing, just flinging stones. This guy is a marksman. He is very accurate with it. And when he goes out, Goliath makes fun of him. Am I a dog that you come after me with sticks? And David says, Goliath, the Lord will deliver you into my hand. And so in the dramatic scene, he picks up 5 smooth stones as he crosses the brook at the bottom of the valley. And when he approaches Goliath, he runs toward him with the sling and lets it fly. Hits him in the forehead. He falls over backwards, unconscious. David runs up to him, picks up his sword, slices off his head, and kills him. And we're told that at the end of the day, when he was taken into Saul's tent at the end of the battle, he was still carrying carrying Goliath's head by the hair and carrying his sword when he entered Saul's tent. We never put that part in the story at Sunday school, but that's what happens. And in the aftermath,
I was going to say, I didn't hear that.
you didn't hear that, did you? No, we don't tell that part of the story. But
I thought it was a little slingshot.
No, this is a serious weapon. And the Philistine army flees, and the Israelites pursue them. It tells, and in the Heroes, Scoundrels, and Kings, I found pictures that we actually mapped out where the battle took place. They pursued them, and there was a great slaughter that day. So David enters the king's army after this. But the image of David and Goliath is still with us. It still shows up in our world today, like when a Palestinian boy confronts an Israeli tank. David is a very successful soldier. And after a while, he's so successful that when he goes back into the city, people are chanting, Saul has killed his thousands, David has killed his 10,000s. And what happens? What's the logical thing that's going to happen? Saul gets jealous. And he's trying to find a way to get rid of David. And so David is going to marry his daughter, Michal. Saul says, I know what to do. I'll get rid of him. He says, you want to marry my daughter? Okay, the dowry I want from you is 100 Philistine foreskins. Bad enough cutting off their heads, but they're not going to give those away. So David and his men go out, and he comes back and delivers to Saul 200 foreskins. They've murdered 200 men for that's the price for his wife. And in the aftermath, Saul's depression gets worse and worse. And at one point, he picks up a javelin and throws it at David while he's playing the harp for him, tries to kill him. David ends up fleeing and living as an outlaw for several years. Jonathan intervenes and tries to smooth things over, but it doesn't work. David flees, and we have the stories of him moving around with his band as outlaws. And he finally goes down and sojourns with the Philistines for a year and a half. And while he's there, he learns the secret to smelting iron. So when he comes back, he brings that knowledge back with him. He has a band of about 200 men who are his followers. They're an outlaw band. And Saul is going to meet the Philistines at the battle at Mount Gilboa in a great battle. The Philistines will not let David go. They don't trust him. So he's not involved in this. But Saul consults a witch prior to the battle. She tells him that he will die and so will his sons the next day in the battle. And in fact, the next day, when the Philistines attack, that is what happens. His sons fall in battle, and Saul, rather than be captured, falls on his sword and dies. So Saul's failing was he didn't recognize that obedience was essential in the sacred trust afforded him by God. So he unified the tribes and pulled them together as nobody had before. But nonetheless, he failed God in a critical way. Now, the people's loyalty is divided. Saul has a surviving son named Ishbosheth. David is the newcomer, the upstart, and he's going to rule from 1010 to 970. But only the tribe of Judah supports David. The other 11 tribes are backing Ishbosheth. Joab is David's general. He's running things. And Abner is Ishbosheth's general. And civil war follows. But you didn't know there was a Jewish civil war, did you? But between when Saul has died, there's a big contest over who's going to take over as the new leader, the new ruler. And finally, Abner, after this goes on for about a year, has had enough, and he arranges a peace meeting with Joab, David's general. Now, in the military, when you greet somebody else, what do you do? Salute with which hand? Right hand. Why? No, it means there's no weapon in your hand. We shake hands with our right hand. There's no weapon in my hand. In this culture, when you greet somebody, when two men meet, you grab the person's beard with your right hand and embrace him with your left to show there's no weapon in my hand. Joab is left-handed, like me. So when he meets Abner, he greets him with his hand on his beard, reaches behind him, and stabs Abner in the back. So in the aftermath, David's got a mess on his hand, but the upshot is Ishbosheth's officers rise up and slay him, and then they go to David expecting a reward. And David says no, he executes the assassins. But in the aftermath, Israel is finally united under David. He pulls all the tribes together. So that's one of the first major accomplishments he does. Gets the other 11 to pledge allegiance to other 11 tribes to pledge allegiance to him. He establishes Jerusalem, conquers Jerusalem as the new head of the country. It's the new national capital because it doesn't belong to any tribe. It's a neutral setting. So it becomes the new focus for the nation. So the city of David is now the religious as well as the political capital of Israel. And all this is possible because there is a power vacuum in the Middle East. Egypt is not dominant. Assyria has not come on the scene, and Babylon's still way down the line. So at this time, he can expand the nation. He can unify it. Furthermore, all commerce going between Egypt and Africa over to Mesopotamia or around to Europe, what was now Europe, has to go through this region. So trade is big in here, and so that they prosper. And in that power vacuum, David's able to come to ascendancy. But the problem is, despite his success as an administrator and a king, there's sin in the royal family. David is polygamous. By the end of his life, he has 7 wives and a bunch of concubines. But despite that, when he sees Bathsheba bathing on the roof one night, he has an affair with her and she becomes pregnant. Her husband is in his army out on the field, Uriah the Hittite. And so he arranges for him to come in to report to him and go home to his wife, but he's not going to go home to sleep with his wife while his men are sleeping in the field. So David's stuck with the problem that he's got a pregnant mistress and an uncooperative husband. So he has him sent to the front with the troops, and he's killed at the battle. And he doesn't kill him directly, but he's responsible for his death. And then he marries Bathsheba. And there's this dramatic scene in which Nathan the prophet comes in to David and tells a story about this man who has just poor man who has just one little lamb. That's all he has as his prized possession. And the landowner has great flocks, but when the landowner entertains some guests, he doesn't take a lamb from his flock. He goes over and takes the man's little lamb, slays it, and feeds it to his guests. And he says, now what should be done to that man? And David thunders, that man should surely die. Nathan says, my king, you are that man. And he pronounces judgment upon David for his affair with Bathsheba. And the judgment is, the child shall die, and the sword shall not depart from your house. And in fact, after the baby is born, it lives a few days and then it dies. David goes back to his wife, back to Bathsheba. They have another child who is Solomon. That's the replacement. But as the story goes on, his eldest son, Amnon, rapes his half-sister Tamar. And later on, Absalom, the next son in line, gets his revenge because he kills his half-brother, and then he flees. And he lives as an exile for several years. But then Joab, the general, works out a compromise and gets him brought back into the royal house. But is Absalom grateful? Absalom starts fomenting a revolution against his father. And eventually, after being reinstated to the royal house, he leads a rebellion, drives his father and the army out of the city. David flees with his family and his wives, and he leaves his concubines behind, and Absalom goes in front of it, the whole city, and has sex with his father's concubines, just to assert his dominance. David and Joab reorganize the army out in the bush, and in a battle with Absalom's forces, defeat them. And Absalom is fleeing on his donkey, and he's known for his long hair. And as he rides under a tree, his hair gets snagged in the branches, and he gets tangled in it, and it gets pulled off his donkey and is hanging by his hair from the tree. And Joab comes up and slays him as he's hanging from the tree. So David retakes the city and continues on to the end of his life. There is no temple in the city. Still the tabernacle, the tent, is where God is worshipped. David has wanted to build a temple to God. But God says, no, because you have blood on your hands. You shall not do it. So David charges Solomon, after he's gone, to build the temple. And further, he charges his son to obey the Lord. David designates Solomon as his heir to the throne, with Nathan and Bathsheba present. Meanwhile, his eldest surviving son, Adonijah, is out saying that he's the new heir to the throne. And then they start hearing that, no, your father is designated Solomon. And David ruled for 40 years. Then when he dies, Solomon takes over. So what's Solomon going to do? You see, Solomon's going to reign for almost 40 years as well. His first task is to assimilate power. So Adonijah is slain, Abiathar the priest is exiled, and Joab is slain. Solomon asks God for wisdom. And God says, because you've asked for wisdom, you shall have wealth as well. So he begins a massive building campaign. The first thing he's going to build is that temple, a spiritual and political center for the nation. And it is a wonder of the ancient world. It is splendid. The construction took 7 years. And it's very elaborate. All the descriptions are in the scriptures about how everything was overlaid, cedar walls overlaid with gold, and all the furniture for the temple as well. So he keeps building. He built palaces, public buildings, stables for 40,000 horses, chariots, and 12,000 cavalry. Now, what do you need to do all that? You need labor. So what they do is they have a conscripted labor procedure called the corvée. Everybody has to work for the king, and it's used to construct all these public buildings. So every man in the country owes the king 1 month out of 3 for labor. So we're told that he had 30,000 people working in Lebanon. He had 150,000 working in Israel, plus officers and supervisors. You think all the people were running around going, I'm so happy, work for my king. I'm so happy. There's there's real resentment about this. He developed a sailing fleet and trade prospered. He's known as wise and wealthy. And what he's doing is he's building financial alliances, economic alliances with everybody around him. And one of the ways he seals the bargain is he marries their daughter. So he ends up with 700 wives and 300 concubines. Now, I've always heard that he was the smartest man in the world. So how did the smartest man in the world end up with 700 wives? Beyond me. Anyway, Jerusalem becomes a city of wealth, splendor, and religious life. And people flock there. Queen of Sheba comes and brings gifts. She wants to see this man who's supposed to be the wisest, smartest man in the world. Solomon, when we read in his letters, he set out to make himself the wisest man in the world. He set out to try to know everything there was to know. And for his day and age, he pretty well succeeded. And but despite that, he has weaknesses. Now, Israel's fortunes are booming at this time because of that power vacuum and because all the trade goes through here. So by the time he's at his peak, through this power vacuum in the Middle East, what we find is that the kingdom stretched from Mesopotamia clear to the borders of Egypt. Today, Israel is just about this much. But at that time, it was a huge territory. There's no major wars, little conflict. And so in that context, Israel grows rich. But remember all those people working for the king? Conscripted labor and taxes have become a burden to the nation. In addition, those 700 wives, they all brought their religions with them. So now we have religious pluralism in Israel. And Solomon stops worshiping God and allows apostasy in the nation. So when he dies, his son Rehoboam takes over. And Rehoboam talks to his father's advisors and he says, "What do you think I should do?" And they said, "Well, you should lighten the burden on the people." And he talks to his own advisors, his own age, and they tell Rehoboam, "Oh, the people are lazy, double the load on them," which he does. And another guy named Jeroboam incites a revolt and the kingdom splits. You have two separate nations now out of that kingdom. After Solomon dies, things fall apart. 10 tribes to the north form the nation of Israel, with the capital at Samaria. People to the south, the tribes of Judah and Benjamin, formed the nation of Judah with the capital at Jerusalem. So Israel, the northern kingdom, is prosperous, urbane, and very polytheistic. Judah to the south is poor, agrarian, and they maintain the worship of God at the temple, but it's not consistent. The kingdoms divide, but now the problem is there's a new power at work. After Solomon's death, Assyria now has come to dominance and rules the world. So they exercise. Assyria now dominates everything that's going on, and they are subject to the dominance of the empire. So Israel and Judah are very different places. Israel is going to last from 931 to 722 BC. They are not worshiping God. They established golden calves at 2 points in the country, to the north and to the south, at Dan and Samaria. They primary dynasties are Jeroboam, Omri, Ahab, and Jezebel, and Jehu. Now remember Jehu, we're going to come back to him. He's the last king at 722. The prophets we meet are Elijah and Elisha, Amos, Hosea, and Micah. And Assyria conquers them and deports the 10 tribes. I'll tell you more about that in a moment. Judah, meanwhile, is created at the same time, but it lasts until 586 BC, about 140 years longer. They maintain the temple worship off and on. They're not really consistent. Their dynasties include Rehoboam, Asa, Jehoshaphat, Joash, Uzziah, Hezekiah, and Josiah. There are about 40 kings between these two countries in the course of this period. So it can get really confusing. The prophets that we're going to deal with here are Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Nahum, and Habakkuk. And Babylon will defeat it, will conquer it in 605. but it won't be until 586 they destroy the city. And I'll tell you about that in a moment. So Israel, 931 to 722 BC. Assyria comes in and they decide to fight the Assyrians rather than cut a treaty with them. And they lose. So the 10 tribes are not wiped out. They deport the 10 tribes of people, spread them all through that vast empire, and bring in people from that empire to settle what was Israel. So they intermarry them out of existence, just dispersed and assimilated into other cultures. These are the lost tribes of Israel that you hear about. And it's documented for us in what's known as Sennacherib's column. Sennacherib was the king who conquered them. And we have this column written in cuneiform, which describes their military conquests. And among the references are the line that I trapped Jehu in his city like a bird. That's why I said remember the name Jehu, the last king of Israel, because we have documentation of his existence and of that battle in Sennacherib's column. Meanwhile, Judah survives. They pay a ransom to Assyria, and Assyria comes in basically and strips all the gold out of the temple and takes all the wealth of the land that they can. And the gold is replaced by bronze instead. It's a hint of what it was, but nothing as great. Assyria is conquered by Babylon. Babylon comes through in 605 and conquers the nation, and they deport the cream of society. This is when Daniel and others are carried off to Babylon. And in response, they put Zedekiah in control as a puppet king. But Ezekiel ends up in Babylon with the Jews. Jeremiah remains in Judah with the people who are left behind. So you have two prophets at the extremes. Zedekiah gets it into his head that he doesn't want to have to answer to the Babylonians anymore, so he rebels. And it takes a while for Babylon. I think it's like 7 years before the Babylonians get there with their army, but they lay siege to the city, and they finally conquer it. And in the aftermath, Zedekiah's sons are brought in front of him. They are killed in front of him, and then they put out his eyes. So the last thing he sees is his dead sons. And everybody of any value at all now is deported to Babylon. Just the riffraff are left behind. Jeremiah stays with the riffraff, and there's a governor put in charge. He ends up rebelling, and people flee from Judah down to Egypt. And we're told that down in Egypt, Jeremiah made another prophecy that they didn't like, and he was stoned to death in Egypt. Jerusalem is burned and looted, and the temple treasures and palace wealth are taken to Babylon. This is where, in 586 BC, the Ark of the Covenant disappears. It's lost. We have no idea what happened to it. And if you look in the Bible for Dummies, it gives you some ideas of where they think it might have gone, but whatever happened to it, we don't know. And it's never seen again. Despite Raiders of the Lost Ark, it's never seen again. But the people settle in Babylon, and Jeremiah writes to them and says, settle down, plant vineyards, let your kids get married. You're going to be there for a while. And they are. They're there for 50 years. So by the rivers of Babylon, we sat down and wept when we remembered Zion. Yeah, that's the psalm that talks about that. And actually, this is the earliest existing map that we know of. It's on a fired clay tablet, and it's a map of Babylon and the various islands and cities. But the people struggle to maintain their identity in a foreign land. Here we have the beginning of the diaspora, the dispersion of the Jews throughout the world. Babylon is a very sophisticated, polished place. This is the Ishtar Gate. It's all glazed ceramic tiles. It's a magnificent piece. And changes to Judaism occur during this period, and they're going to be lasting. First, and one of the major ones is the synagogue develops, and it's focused on the law, not the temple. There's no more temple where they can worship. So they focus on Torah. With that, the priests can't exercise jurisdiction. So the rabbis develop power, and they become the people who support the study of the Torah. Up to this point, everything was focused on the temple and the priesthood. We find the rise of messianic hopes, that there will be a deliverer who will come, who will send us back to our homeland, who will chase out the oppressor. And apocalypticism is the idea that that will happen. There will be an end of time. Meanwhile, the exiles are treated very well. Daniel, Nehemiah, Esther are all stories of people in the service of the Babylonian rulers who are in positions of civil power in the country. But Israel is now at the center of global change. In the 50 years they are in Babylon, Babylon fades from power and the Medo-Persian Empire takes over. We're told in the book of Daniel, it tells about the king throwing this lavish drunken party one night, and while they're having this drunken party, the handwriting comes on the wall, Mene, Tekel Upharsin, weighed in the balance and found wanting. And while the party's going on, the Persians have bribed a guard who opened the gate and let them into the city. They conquer Babylon without a fight in 539 BC. So now power shifts from Babylon to Persia. And this is a cylinder which contains the Edict of Cyrus. And it's, again, cuneiform writing. And he says that he is sending the exiles home with their treasures in 535 BC. And away they go. Zerubbabel leads them back to Judah. This is seen as the second Exodus. So Isaiah and Ezekiel's prophecies are fulfilled. The people come home. In 535, Jews return to Israel as free people. But whereas probably several million were taken to Babylon, in the first wave, only 50,000 go back. So yes, they return, but it's not the mass exodus that we saw in the book of Exodus under Moses. So the Persian Empire now dominates, and they will rule for 200 years. And from India to Helena down to Egypt, they rule the world. And Israel is now under Persian rule. When they come back, their land is in ruins. So they start to rebuild. Everything's got to be started anew. In 520, Darius I rules the Persian Empire, and the Jews lay the foundation for a second temple. It's completed in 516, but it's a far smaller building than Solomon's grand temple was. During this time, we see the rise of sects in Judaism. We get the development of the Pharisees, the separate, the pure ones. The Hasidim, who were even a sect beyond that, the pure. We have the commoners, Am Haaretz, people of the land, the commoners. We see that as we go on, after 350 BC, we'll see the development of Hellenizers, who cooperate with the successors to the Persians, which will be the Greeks under Alexander. That's next week. And they abandon Judaism and become Greek in their thinking. Sadducees are members of the Sanhedrin, the governing council at the temple, but they're collaborators with Rome, which is in the 1st century BC. And finally, we have the Zealots, who are the revolutionaries. During the diaspora, the Jews are spread all across the world. We focus on Babylon, but they were in Alexandria, Egypt. There's more Jews in Alexandria at the time of Jesus than there were in Judea. Damascus, Syria still has a big population. And of course, Babylon down in Persia. And Rome has a great population. Athens, Corinth, in Helena. This isn't called Greece at that time, it's called Helena. And now we find the law, the Torah, has become the center of life. So the synagogue takes on a significant role in people's lives. And we find the rise of messianism and apocalypticism at this time. The hope that God's coming anointed one will deliver the people. And Messiah or Christ means the anointed one. And in apocalypticism, the belief that God will intervene in this world order to deliver the people from the oppressor. And in the end, God's people receive blessed life and the oppressor goes to hell. Daniel is a good example of the apocalyptic literature. And it reveals the future in veiled terms. It sustains hope for the people in the face of hopelessness. And it affirms that God rules and God will rule on the day of judgment. This world will come to an end. And Jews were sustained by their eschatology as they waited for that end. And in the meantime, they kept the law. Well, kind of. In 457, Ezra returns, and he leads priestly reforms because he's concerned that the people are not following God the way they should. He is sent to Jerusalem and initiates religious reforms and purges foreign marriages. Anybody that's married to a foreigner is forced to divorce them and kick them out of the country. He wants to purify the nation. Well, what you got is massive social upheaval. Nonetheless, 10 years later, Nehemiah, who is a cupbearer to the Emperor Artaxerxes, asked for permission to go back and help the people rebuild the walls. So they came back in 535. It's 444, and they still haven't rebuilt the walls of the city of Jerusalem. So he goes back with authorization to rebuild, and he is a very able administrator. He organizes the work, and despite opposition by local enemies, in 52 days, they rebuild the walls and secure the city. So Ezra has come back as a religious leader. Nehemiah is the administrator and the governor, and they reestablish civil order. The religious cultus, the religious practices are reestablished and practiced once again. But now Persia has influenced Judaism. Now we see the rise of dualism in their thinking. Dualism is the idea that two equal opposing powers are at war with each other. This was what Zoroastrianism, the religion of Persia, talked about. Our belief is God is not in a war with the devil. God is Lord. Satan is a wimp. And we do not believe a dualism in Christianity or Judaism. You see the rise of talk about the powers of angels and devils. You see eschatology developing, end of time thinking, and Judaism becomes more and more a religion of the law. The synagogue becomes critical in all the villages. So you study the law in your synagogue all year long, and periodically on the big festivals, big 4 festivals of the year, you make the passage down to Jerusalem to worship at the temple. Then you go back and study the law again in the synagogue. Whew. So that's where we are. We hit about 400 BC. That's 600 years we just walked through. Next week, we'll look at the period between the Testaments, between the end of the book of Malachi, the beginning of Matthew. This material is covered in the Apocrypha, the books that are not part of our canon in the Bible. They are included in the Catholic canon and in other works. They'll tell us the story of what happens in that period. So if you look at chapters 13 to 17 of History of the Bible for Dummies, you'll find the material. We're going to look at the history in that period, but also we're going to look at the literature. Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Songs. But the characters we'll meet are Daniel, Esther, Ezra, and Nehemiah at this period. So that's where we are as we continue with the Bible for Dummies. Next week, we're only going to cover about 400 years, unlike today. So I hope you'll join me again next time as we continue with our study of the Bible for Dummies here at Chapel by the Sea on Fort Myers Beach, Florida. Questions or comments?
Do the Philistines become the Palestine?
You know, I don't know what happens to the Philistines. That's interesting. I never thought of that. What happened to the Philistines? Are they the Palestinians now?
Because there's always so much conflict between
Yes.
the two, and they say they were there before the others, and it seems like they were there together.
I'm to dig into that and go back and look at that, because I hadn't even given that any thought. But it's a good question. What happened to the Philistines? Are they the ancestors of the Palestinians? I'll dig into that for next week.
It was just something that I
Yeah,
was thinking about.
because the same places. I mean, the people at the
They were there
coastline.
at the same time, and they were all claiming that they were there
Yeah.
before the other. And if they were there together, then there shouldn't be that much conflict.
Well,
I would think.
You would think, yeah.
But it seems like that's how their entire life was, that there was always conflict between them.
Yeah, yeah. Well, thank you for joining me online, here in person. And we'll pick this up again next time as we continue with the Bible for Dummies.